what do you see as vitally important in that healing process in the light of your experience of apartheid? And perhaps there are lessons that we in Australia can learn from your country's experience as we progress the task of reconciliation with our own indigenous peoples.
Okay, let me, how will I begin to answer this one? I was thinking about bringing in Pope Francis because he's got a wonderful way of reminding us that if we're going to change anything, the only one we can be sure of changing is ourselves. So I'll start with a little incident or anecdote that happened when I arrived in Ireland. I did my training for the priesthood. I joined the Franciscans in Ireland because the diocese I come from was being run by Irish Franciscans. And when I arrived in Ireland, it was my first time as a man of color living with white people. And I was very apprehensive about it. But the year before I went over, my eldest brother went across and he spent 6 months in the novitiate and then he came back. And he told me, oh no, it's just like boarding school, there's no problem. The Irish are very friendly, very hospitable, very welcoming. So I got there and I was expecting that there. But I had to go through a process of conversion, if you like. And the conversion was, I must stop seeing people according to the categories that apartheid had taught me to see people. They were black, they were white, they were colored, and they were Indians. And so the first thing I had to do was to convince myself that whites are not superior. They're different, but they're not superior. And therefore, relate to them person to person, because that's how God has created us. I came back then after 10 years over there. I was ordained a priest and sent into a parish, a rural parish, where the majority of the people were black. Now here I was, as a colored, I'm supposed to be superior to the blacks. And within the first few months of my time in that parish, I went out to one of the outstations. And at the end of the Mass, one of the ladies, a black lady, got up and she said, she gave a speech and she said, we want to welcome our new priest. And I must say, she said, how lovely it is to have one of our own sons as our priest. Now, here was somebody who's supposed to be at the bottom of the rung, and she's calling me her son. It really touched me deeply. And it was from that moment I said, as far as I'm concerned, even though the apartheid system makes me still look at people in terms of black, white, colored, and Indian, I am going to deal with people on a face-to-face, on a level of person to person. So the apartheid system leaves those scars on us, there's no doubt about that. And we see that from time to time in the reactions that people have when crimes are committed. Oh, these blacks are always committing crimes. When something unjust is being done, oh, the whites are always unjust. We still automatically react like that. But I think when we look at the younger generation, we can see that there's a real great improvement that is taking place. To give you an example, the other day I met a man who was telling me about his young 7-8-year-old son. He's a white man, and his son had a very good friend. His best friend, in fact, was a little black boy. And the little black boy said to his friend, come on, come and spend the weekend with us. So the father delivers his son, the white man, he delivers his son to this black home. And when the mother of the black child opens the door and welcomes them, the little fella, the white fella, turns to the other one and he says, you didn't tell me your mother was black. Now, I think that's one of the most hopeful signs that South Africa has, that our younger generation are seeing each other as human beings, as friends, and no longer as people in different categories. I think that was the wickedness of apartheid, was made us look at people according to different racial categories.
I believe that South Africa receives a fair number of asylum seekers and refugees, even as we speak.
Yes.
And yet, Australia seems to turn its back on on refugees and asylum seekers at the moment, as you well know. And the Stop the Boat policy is ascribed to by both sides of politics in this country, which is a very sad thing, especially for us Vietnamese refugees who were welcomed in this country at a time that was no less challenging than it is today. And yet our nation rose to the challenge and accepted an unprecedented number of Asian refugees for the first time in its history. So as former boat people, we're very disappointed and very concerned about the way Australia treats its asylum seekers and refugees. And we look to places like your country, which by comparison is not as wealthy, and yet seems to be more welcoming and more compassionate.
Bishop Long, I think you're going to have to come to South Africa because the similarities are so close. You will probably feel you're quite at home there, you know. First of all, you can come to Durban as a fellow Franciscan to welcome you there.
Thank you for your having.
But why I say that is just in the last few weeks, we had a similar reaction by some people in politics. And in this case, it was the King of the Zulus, who began a celebration of what was supposed to be moral reconstruction, moral regeneration, by saying to people that one of the problems that we are facing in South Africa is criminals who are coming in from other countries and are causing havoc in our communities. That was the one thing he said. The second one was to say that we are now being overrun by illegal foreigners who are now taking up jobs that we should be we should be reserving for our own people, and so on and so forth. So he was building up a picture which was very similar to what you've described as the policy of those in Parliament here in Australia to keep out foreigners, whether they're refugees, asylum seekers, or whatever. But he went further. I think the applause of the crowd he was speaking to got through to him. And while he started off by saying, we must tell these criminals that are coming here to cause problems in our community, and those who are illegally here, tell them to go pack up and go home. But he went further and he said, the government is afraid because that it might lose votes if it takes a hard stand against the people who are coming in. But as your king, I have to say what needs to be said. And I say they must all get up and go. Now, that was the very opposite to what we would have expected, considering that almost the majority of our leaders who took over the country in 1994 and have been in government ever since were housed as refugees in other countries of Africa during the real troubled times. Now, to hear a leader saying that the Africans who have offered hospitality over the years, a long time too, it was 50, 60 years in some instances, and tell them they must all go, their people must go back, they're not welcome. Now, that came to the point now where the local people used any excuse to violently throw out refugees from their houses, from their shops, businesses, whatever they had, and they looted and took everything. So these people ended up, some of them came to our cathedral parish center called the Dennis Hurley Center. Others went into camps in different parts of the city. And for about 2-3 days, nobody seemed to know what to do. The king had spoken, people were reacting to what the king had said. The worst part of what the king had done was he described the refugees as fleas. And he said, if you want fleas, get rid of fleas, expose them, put them in the sun, fleas run away from the heat. Now that is a terrible thing to say about a human being that is an insect. What do you do with insects? You crush them. That was what started off the genocide in Rwanda. The one lot called the others cockroaches. So you kill a cockroach, you're not killing a person, you're killing a cockroach. It's an insect. And I think this is what was so disappointing for us, was to hear a man who was very respected, the king of the Zulus, saying, these people are fleas, they must be thrown out of the country. The government then did react, but they reacted more to the negative response that they got from other African governments than to the injustice that was being done to the refugees there and then. You can imagine if some elements here in Australia started saying, get rid of all these foreigners that have come here, they're taking our jobs, they're taking our businesses, and so on. There would be I think the community would be terribly shocked. Well, we were really shocked by the reaction there.
Now, right. Pope Francis, you are one of a very few who were at the conclave which elected Pope Francis. I must confess, when I saw him on that balcony the night of his election, I was flabbergasted. I was so amazed by the manner of his self-presentation.
The Pope, after he's been elected, he has to be asked these two questions. They are recorded by the notaries that come into at the end of the conclave. Then he's taken to a little room on the side, just called the Chapel of Tears, because that's where they go and change. So he came there, he went there to take off his cardinal's soutane, and he put on the Pope's one, the white one. Came out, and normally the Pope, the newly elected Pope, would have a chair set in front of the altar where we are sitting here, and he would sit down, and each of the cardinals would come up and pay their respects to him. Pope Francis came, stood for a moment in front of the altar, and then went straight down, halfway down the Sistine Chapel. Obviously, he remembered that one of the cardinals there has difficulties walking. So he went down to go and greet this cardinal, and he wouldn't let him stand up. He embraced him where he was sitting. Then came back and stood and received all of us standing up. So here was a clear indication, I think, that right from the start, Pope Francis, who had listened very carefully to that advice that had been given by the various cardinals, collegiality meant he is one with the other cardinals and bishops that were present there. Really, it was very, very touching stuff. And then he went out onto the balcony, and the first thing he did was to break with convention. Instead of saying, the Lord be with you and all that, he said, buonasera, buona gente, or something to that effect. Good evening, good people. Please give me your blessing, pray for me, and then I'll give you my blessing. Now, for a pope to say that is just unimaginable. And I think it was a very clear indication as to how he was going to lead us in a very spiritual way, very practical, very down to earth.
And a very humble way.
Very, very humble. Really like St. Francis. Thank you.